Next, we're going to turn to another vision of written sources as material, I think, from Marina Rustow, who is Chadori A. Zilka Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East and Professor of Near Eastern Studies and History at Princeton University. She's also the director there of the Geniza Lab. Marina has won a long list of prizes, including the MacArthur Grant in 2015, a National Endowment for the Humanities Collaborative Fellowship with Eve Krakowski and Craig Perry from 2014 to 2017, a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2014, an American Council of Learned Societies Collaborative Fellowship with Eve Krakowski 2015 to 2017, another American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, and another National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Her first book, Heresy and the Politics of Community, The Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate, used records from the Cairo Geniza to examine questions of heresy and when the idea of heresy was deployed by members of the Jewish community against each other and when it wasn't. It won the Salo-Whitmire-Barron Book Prize in Jewish Studies in 2009. And the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award in Ancient and Medieval Jewish History in 2007, for 2007 to 2011. She has a new book forthcoming from Princeton. It's called The Lost Archive, Traces of a Caliphate in a Cairo Synagogue, which uses Geniza documents found in the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo in a new way, rather than reading the Hebrew texts and focusing only on their bearing on Jewish history. She reads the Arabic and uses them as evidence of administrative record keeping and the strength of Fatimid institutions. So more generally, she's engaging with this question that we've already talked briefly about today of the archive in Islamic societies and the material ecology of documents in non-European contexts. She taught previously at Johns Hopkins University and Emory. And today she will be talking to us about the near past, the distant past, and the political legitimacy of the Fatimids and Buyids. Please join me in welcoming Marina Rustow.
Thank you very much, Abby, and thank you all. This has been an absolutely fascinating day. I love the coherence of this. I'm afraid that my paper is going to be a little bit too coherent, which is to say that you might not hear anything you haven't already heard, but I take that as a good sign that we're all kind of thinking in tandem. Also, I just want to issue a caveat or an apology about the title because it actually has nothing to do with what my paper ended up being about. I invented this title before I had actually started doing the research for this, and it's been an absolutely fascinating 4 or 5 months of reading, during which I found myself kind of in the eddy of trying to figure out what antiquarianism is, could be, was in different contexts. So this is going to be a little bit of a think piece, but I hope it'll be useful given what's gone under the bridge today. First of all, I just want to say that I found the number of pieces of evidence on behalf of what I think can, by a very strict definition, be called Islamic antiquarianism. I found the evidence to be far more abundant than I expected it to be. And so I'm actually very sanguine about this. And I started out by using the strictest possible definition of antiquarianism so as not to stretch the category tendentiously just because I wanted to define antiquarianism in the medieval Islamic world. So what I'm really kind of looking for evidence of is the search for knowledge of the past through objects and texts both, but not texts only. So that's kind of what I set myself. I restricted myself in the main to the period before the period of Mamluk encyclopedism. First of all, because I knew that others here would cover it. And also because I wanted to know what was going on without the impulse to completeness that you see in Mamluk era encyclopedism. So there's no doubt in my mind, or probably in anyone else's here, but we'll find out tomorrow, that Mamluk encyclopedists were antiquarians. I think there's no shortage of examples, whether you think of An-Nuwairi in the 13th, 14th century or Al-Maqrizi in the 14th, 15th. So in light of that, I think it's all the more strange that it's still common, not just for people to not realize how much antiquarianism there really was in the medieval Islamic world, but actually to deny it outright. So basically, you have like a couple of schools of thought. The first one I'm going to talk about is Michael Cook's Pharaonic History in Medieval Egypt from 1983, because he's really the denier in chief, which is to say he's the main person who comes out and says, no, absolutely no antiquarianism in the medieval Islamic world. Don't get the wrong idea. Like, don't start spreading rumors that there's tension at Princeton. Michael is a fantastic, conscientious colleague, a fantastic scholar, indefatigable curiosity, really like comparable to an antiquarian himself in his indefatigable curiosity. He's a masterful pedagogue. However, in Pharaonic History of Medieval Egypt, he kind of restricts his focus, I think, somewhat characteristically to origins as being determinative of later practices. So one of the things he says here is that the second question is the degree to which medieval Egypt retained, and by the way, I'm going to be focusing mostly on Egypt because that's what I know and love, the degree to which medieval Egypt retained or felt itself to retain a continuity with the pre-Islamic past. In particular, were medieval Egyptians heirs to a native Egyptian tradition regarding the ancient history of their country? So that native is going to become key in a minute. And did they possess any sense of identification with that history? It is this latter question on which this article is intended to shed some light. So he goes on to, first of all, dismiss Ibn Wahshiya's Shawq al-Mustaham fi Ma'rifat Rumuz al-Aqlam as, quote, a largely bogus collection of ancient scripts. There are about 300 in there. That is, quote, hermetic in character. So what does he mean by hermetic? He means something a European audience can readily associate with the magic flute, teeming with priests learned in astrology and magic, sage rulers, marvelous constructions, talismans, treasures, ancient wisdom, and occasional glimpses of monotheist truth. I call it hermetic partly for the handful of references to Hermes that it contains, partly because this term catches the overall atmosphere, and partly because of some implicit hermetic links, which will appear in due course. So basically what he says is this is a kind of concatenation of irrational beliefs, that it originated in Iraq in the 10th century, not in Egypt, and that it's basically completely phantasmagoric texts, not material reality. And where the focus on origins comes in is that he doesn't admit of the possibility, like, let's say that he's correct, that Egypt became aware of its ancient past through these 10th century Iraqi texts, which I think is like totally far-fetched because there are pyramids that you can't really ignore. But let's just take that, for the moment as a given. It's still possible that given the influx of these texts to Egypt at a certain point, people would have looked at the material evidence around them differently and also from a non-hermetic point of view. So I think that what Cook calls hermetic, other people might readily recognize as antiquarian. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the affirmers, that there actually is medieval Islamic antiquarianism. So pitched specifically against Cook, there's the Michael Cooperson article about El-Ma'mun, the pyramids, and the hieroglyphs. So basically, Cooperson takes the instance in which the Abbasid Caliph El-Ma'mun spent part of the year 832 or 217 Hijri in Egypt, during which he reportedly broke into the pyramid of Khufu and explored its interior. So for Cooperson, the issue isn't only whether the 9th century explorers of pyramids were antiquarians. He thinks they were. But he also goes further and claims that Al-Ma'mun's exploration of the pyramid was understood by the later Egyptian historians who wrote about it to have been a search for knowledge. He says that this stands to reason given that Al-Ma'mun's reign was characterized by the translation of ancient Greek works on astronomy, mathematics, geography, and medicine, that an observatory was built in Baghdad and another near Deir Muran above Damascus, that the circumference of the earth was measured twice, the first time by determining the length of a terrestrial degree on the flat plain of Sinjar in northern Iraq, and the second time by measuring the declination of the sun from a mountaintop in Cappadocia. This is like sounding very early modern European to my ears. That the first treatise on algebra dedicated to Al-Ma'mun was written by Al-Khwarizmi during his reign, and finally that Al-Ma'mun ordered the preparation of a comprehensive set of world maps and star charts. So Cooperson's larger point is that we shouldn't read anything into the fact that the chroniclers whom you'd expect to relate the story of Al-Ma'mun and the pyramid, like Al-Yaqubi and At-Tabari, say nothing at all about it. He says that's not a big deal because that's actually not where this material would be found. Rather, it's in the literature of scientists and early encyclopedists. which makes actually perfect sense when you think about it. So he says, without the surviving works of contemporaries such as Al-Khwarizmi, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the writings of later scientists such as Al-Biruni, or the biobibliographical compilations by Ibn Nadim, Ibn Abi Usayba, and Ibn al-Qifti, we would hardly know that Al-Ma'mun was an active patron of the sciences. So basically the material that Cooperson brings, and by the way, these aren't the only two, I'm just kind of giving them as emblematic of the sides of the spectrum. The material that Cooperson brings on Al-Ma'mun is the tip of an iceberg measured against which Cook's article is, I'm afraid, a sinking Titanic. So I can't claim to have gotten to the bottom of this issue by any stretch of the imagination. This is a topic that's like new to me and fascinating. But I do think that there's a lot of work for us here in this room to do. One thing that doesn't need to be done, that we don't need to concern ourselves with, is making the anti-Orientalist argument that early modern Europeans, weren't the first antiquarians. Let me phrase that positively. That was very confusing. We do not need to make the anti-Orientalist argument that Egyptians were the first antiquarians of their own stuff, because that's already been taken care of. And it's been taken care of in a book that needs to be used with caution by Okasha Adali, Egyptology, the Missing Millennium. So the book argues, among other things, that long before Champollion, medieval Muslims cracked half of hieroglyphics using some combination of Coptic and their own ingenuity. It's full of examples of medieval Arab Egyptology, some of it pulled from unpublished manuscripts. It needs to be used with caution because it mixes historical levels, which is to say, he discusses not only decoding hieroglyphs, but also treasure hunting, Hermeticism, continuities with the ancient Egyptian past. And there's also, I think, a kind of naive reading of some of the sources that I would question. But in general, I think that his thesis is irrefutable, which is that there's plenty of evidence that, in fact, there was a native Egyptian engagement with Egyptian antiquities. So over the course of my investigation in the past few months, I came to define antiquarianism on the most general level as interest in objects from the past for the sake of knowledge specifically. And I'll be a little bit more specific later, but just for now, I think that suffices. So what that means is that I had to rule out the consideration of certain phenomena. I spent a couple of months in a rabbit hole of spolia, from which I then emerged. Oh, by the way, this is another illustration from Adali's book, so it's really nice for some of the manuscript material that he brings. So I spent a while thinking through the question of spolia. This is many of you are probably familiar with this. It's a Gothic church portal in the Madrasa and tomb of the Mamluk Sultan An-Nasr Muhammad in Cairo, built in the 14th century. And what you're actually looking at is a monumental doorway from the Crusader capital of Akka, which the Mamluks conquered in 1291. So this is a kind of classic example of supersessionist spoliation or triumphalist spoliation, which is to say, we conquered Akka, we got the doorway, we're going to put it in our big monumental complex in Cairo. Is this antiquarianism? I ask. Likewise, supersessionist spoliation it's not an uncommon phenomenon. As John Wilkinson demonstrated 30 years ago, and Mattia Giudetti has recently reiterated, at the Haram al-Sharif, 80% of the columns are pre-Islamic, often of different heights and thicknesses, suggesting that there was actually some effort made to incorporate them. And given the context of the site the site of the destroyed Jewish temple in a building containing anti-Trinitarian inscriptions, it seems that this too would be a patently supersessionist statement. So is this antiquarianism? I would argue no in both cases, that in the rare cases when you can actually interpret spolia clearly, as in cases of supersessionist intent, it's precisely not the acquisition of knowledge driving the possession or repossession of antiquities. So the problem that I alluded to earlier in the question and answer period this morning about interpreting spolia, I learned a lot from an article by the art historian Michael Greenhalgh in an article that he delightfully titled Spolia, a definition in ruins. So what he says is that the problem has to do with what he calls the inevitable desire to find meaning in every reused stone. But as Conrad just asked, and I think that's exactly the right question, which meaning? So there's a spectrum of possibilities. There's the practicality argument. So Greenhalgh wants to argue overwhelmingly for convenience rather than to proclaim any meaning. And he says, unless there's compelling evidence to the contrary, it is surely redundant to argue for meaning in material reused in close vicinity to antique sites, such as Rome or Venosa. So that's a little bit overly skeptical for my taste. Perhaps spolia are laying claim to a past heritage or to continuity with the past. Perhaps the use of spolia is homage, a frank admission of the superiority or temporal priority of the previous civilization, coupled with an attempt to legitimize one's own through it. Perhaps spolia are regarded as relics and have, as a couple of people have already mentioned, talismanic power or other sorts of sanctity. Or perhaps, again, the use of spolia is about cultural competition, appropriating the legitimacy and social capital of the prior or conquered civilization. But the problem that we have here is the usual historian's problem of judging intent, compounded by the archaeologist's problem of interpreting mute objects. We just can't know in many cases why ancient materials were reused. So simply for the purposes of this investigation, I've ruled out spolia. That's not to say that I reject the whole investigation altogether. I read the Barry Flood article on the talismanic power of certain spolia and thought it was fantastic. Stephanie and Alain, the examples that you brought of pharaonic stones in Islamic architecture with the hieroglyphs clearly visible, I think are very convincing. And I think spolia do have a place in this story, not just as apotropaion, but also as an object of collection and of knowledge. But I wanted to make the strongest possible argument I could, so I ruled it out. Also a little bit against type because I actually, I work on spolia. So I work on fragments of Fatimid chancery decrees that were reused, generally speaking, for Hebrew script texts. And I actually do make an argument that there's meaning in the reuse, which is an argument, in fact, that Conrad really pushed me on, and I'm very grateful to him for doing it. But for this context, I wanted to kind of rule that out. I've also ruled out treasure hunting. Grave robbing, and the plundering of materials. There are lots of accounts of treasure hunting in the medieval Islamic world, probably too many to mention, including reports that the mosque of Ibn Tulun was built with plundered pharaonic gold, and that the eponymous governor of Egypt, Ibn Tulun, made digging for gold a state monopoly, or at least subject to state regulation. I've also ruled out marvels and wonders. So people have mentioned the ajaib literature or mirabilia texts. It's not that they can't contain antiquarian elements. I think actually we have a very good shot at finding antiquarian moments in ajaib literature. And that's probably one of the first places that we should be looking. But I also think that the I don't want to call it a genre because it's not really a genre, but that the impulse of commenting on ajaib it's a slightly different impulse from the antiquarian one. And I think actually Stephanie might have said this verbatim during the Q&A earlier, which is that wonder and knowledge are not quite the same thing. Wonder mystifies and knowledge demystifies. So they can certainly be linked to each other, and wonder can be the provocation for knowledge. Carlo Ginzburg talks about the euphoria of ignorance, something I often experience, though it's not always euphoria. But I think ajaib have to be treated carefully in this case. And there's also the question of whether ajaib is really a genre at all. So this is an interesting argument that Syrinx von Hess has recently made, that because you find comments on mirabilia in travel literature, geographic literature, natural histories, and other sorts of texts, the texts are not formally the same. And because they're not formally the same, you have to kind of look at the commentary on ajaib as working slightly differently in these different contexts. As for instances of continuity with the past, I think if there's no sense of the difference between the us now and the them then, it probably can't qualify as antiquarian, although admittedly sometimes there's a fine line between continuity and discontinuity. This is a strange piece which some of you might know. It's a piece of Tiraz that's been dated to the Fatimid period. There is a band in Thuluth that has been read as Al-Yumn wal-Iqbal. And then there are another three bands that Al-Dali at least has interpreted as pseudo-hieroglyphic. I'm skeptical, and I'd like to hear your opinions. I think probably pseudo-Kufic is the way to go. So there's all kinds of Fatimid engagements with various aspects of the Egyptian past, including famously Fatimid participation in Coptic festivals. And I think all of these are basically borderline cases. There's a really interesting article by Christian Canier that argues that Coptic ceremonies and rituals among the Fatimids manifest curiosity for Egypt's ancient past and even make claims to an Egyptian, quote, national particularism, une spécificité nationale, or in Arabic, sharbia. Maybe, but I think that the bid for Fatimid popular legitimacy is so transparent that I really hesitate to call that antiquarianism because there's such a kind of transactional political motive. I think an antiquarian would observe the festivals, not go on record as sponsoring them and participating in them. So as you can see, I tried to be rigorous, maybe overly so, I don't know. Antiquarianism then would be consciousness of the past as past, interest in objects from the past for the sake of knowledge. But even there, even defining the phenomenon in the strictest possible construction, I think we have plenty of evidence. And the pieces of evidence, I mean, these are like by no means uncommon. They're quoted in lots and lots of places. So Al-Mas'udi, who's already been quoted once today, Kitab Muruj al-Dhahab, written in 943, revised in 947 and 956 in Egypt. The work devotes 2 chapters to Pharaonic and Hellenistic Egypt. Even more famously, El-Idrisi, who died in 1237, a work edited by Ulrich Harman in 1989, basically is all about the pyramids. I think Alain quoted from this morning. So I've also considered efforts at revival of the past as a way of making claims in the present. So that I ruled in. And the reason I've done that is this is basically what the antiquaries in Europe were doing. In other words, claims about one's study of the past, one's connection to the past, one's understanding of the past, one's ownership of past objects are ultimately claims to knowledge and power. They're bids for cultural capital, bids for religious or intellectual authority. In other words, claims to revival are always made with a certain kind of cultural capital or political power in mind. So then I asked myself, okay, revival of what? Do you have to be reviving a specifically classical past necessarily? Does it count if you're reviving the classical past of your own religion, as when medieval Jews revived Hebrew for everyday writing in the 9th and 10th century, basically putting Aramaic out of business? Or does it have to be the revival of a lost civilization, as when medieval Egyptians attempted to decode hieroglyphs? Is there a difference between the search for ancient relics when it's for the purposes of religious reverence, so relics properly so called, versus collecting for the sake of knowledge, antiquarianism stricto sensu? So if you think about relics on the one hand and collecting for the sake of knowledge on the other, somebody like Arjuna Padurai would not actually find this to be a significant difference, because either way the object has an aura. It exits the commodity state. It becomes taboo. Or as the triliteral languages would put it, haram or kharam. So I'm actually going to skip the whole question of talismanic value because it's been actually raised so often today that I think I don't need to insist on that point. The point, even restricting ourselves to revival of the pre-Islamic past, I think we can make a robust case for Islamic antiquarianism. Okay, so now, why am I saying Islamicate? So this also has been addressed. I think we need to be very careful to widen our scope and discuss not just Islamic, but Islamicate antiquarianism. The nomenclature is significant because what is clearly a text in hieroglyphs, possibly with some hieratic as well, medieval Arabic writers will routinely call Qibti, Coptic. For Muslims, Copts, Jews, and Zoroastrians are a repository of knowledge about antiquity. So, I mean, with Jews, famously, it's the Israeliyat, where Jews are considered to have kind of special knowledge of a certain pre-Islamic past. Copts are routinely consulted on questions of ancient Egypt. And Zoroastrians, I mean, we've already seen an example today, which I'll get back to in a second. So, in other words, medieval Islamic antiquarians blur the line somehow between antiquarianism and anthropology, that there are actual living people involved whom they can consult as kind of native informants about the past that they're trying to study, which is like not that different from what was going on in early modern Europe. The earlier religions, Muslims who are after all newcomers, see the earlier religions as having a special connection to the pre-Islamic past, and even an autochthonous one in the case of Copts in Egypt and Zoroastrians in Iran. So when the Buyids took over the Abbasid administration, a particularly fascinating thing happened. The Buyids were the sons of a Zoroastrian convert to Islam from Daylem on the Caspian coast. This is a region that had at the time, in the early 10th century, been Zoroastrian in living memory. It had then come under Zaydi, Ismaili, and Twelver Shi'i influence and still harbored deep hostility toward Sunni Islam and the Caliphate. The sons of Buya established capitals at Shiraz, Rai, and Baghdad in the 930s and 940s, and the Abbasid court had little choice but to accept their proxy rule. But then the Buyids made an interesting set of decisions. The first was not to abolish the caliphate, and that's been explained as a kind of move for theopolitical legitimacy, and I think that's probably correct. But the second move was, while not abolishing the caliphate, they opted to revive or re-revive the symbols and the substance, not of Zoroastrianism per se, but of the Sasanians, of the late ancient imperial world that the Arabs had conquered 300 years earlier. So the Buyids proclaimed their own Sasanian ancestry. Stefan alluded to this earlier. They visited the ruins of the Achaemenid capital of Persepolis. They had a Zoroastrian priest translate the Pahlavi inscriptions for them, and then they added inscriptions of their own. Stefan, I found them during the break, so thank you for that conversation. So any Muslim, as Madelung put it, would have considered, forgot to mention one thing. They also adopted the defunct Sasanian title Shahanshah, King of Kings. This is a title that any Muslim, as Madelung put it, would have considered obnoxious and blasphemous, or as the Prophet Muhammad put it, akhna, most obscene. Which is really interesting because in the 1090s, a Fatimid vizier would then follow suit and assume the title Shahanshah as well. So here, so this actually is getting to my title, there's lots and lots of Fatimid imitation of the trappings of imperial legitimacy as put forward by the Buyids, which I'm finding totally fascinating. So when I first got into this question of Fatimid political legitimacy, I was specifically trying to figure out, why do the chancery documents look the way they do? Why suddenly do you have these gorgeous long scrolls with wide line spacing and calligraphic script? I assumed that there must have been some imitation of the Abbasid chancery going on, but what I hadn't realized and only figured out recently is that in fact, there's a whole Buyid stratum here that the Fatimids are picking up on and taking even further. And that has to do with the layout of text, but particularly with the proportioning of script and the script style in which they're writing for the first time. So in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Islamic world was bookended by Shi'i dynasties with large ambitions, each of which required a set of imperial symbols. So both reached into the toolkit of ancient Near Eastern kingship. And when they had to attend to the prosaic business of rule, both continued the documentary idiom of the Abbasid chancery, which had by then achieved the status of the classical. But the odd thing is, so the wrinkle is that while the Buyids were going back to the Sasanians in order to derive their political legitimacy from that kind of symbolism, for the Fatimids there was actually an intervening Buyid past that they were taking over, and it was a very recent past. It was a past that was only 50 or 100 years behind them. So the next set of things that I went on to think about is the what I know best, which is Jews in the Fatimid world. And I thought about the practice of Geniza, of preserving old texts, and then thought about what those texts said, and I thought, okay, can we make a case for Jews in the Fatimid world having some kind of antiquarian-like practices? And here I think we have a problem. So the Jews passed on lots of old things, but usually not objects, just texts. At the same time, the Geniza world is a world full of objects, but it's a world full of new objects. It's a world of consumers, merchants, people with disposable capital because they're working for the for the government or for other reasons. It's a world of textiles in which textiles are almost a form of literal capital, where you accumulate them and you give them out as gifts. And there's a great sensitivity to the details of textiles, to color, to material, to texture. It's not as though it's a world devoid of sensitivity to the material world. It's just that you would look through the documents of the Geniza in vain for evidence of antiquarianism, unless you mean the revival of Hebrew itself, the very fact of keeping a Geniza in the first place, which could be seen as an antiquarian act, and I think that's actually close to the argument that Conrad was just making. But when you go to the level of the philosophical texts, the philosophers and also the jurists, for them, old objects are a big problem. Either they smack of idolatry or they raise halachic problems. Now, there was a Talmudic antiquarianism. The temple objects were the subject of sustained study and even obsession in the earliest strata of rabbinic literature in late antiquity. And here I want to cite a book by Mira Balberg called Blood for Thought, The Reinvention of Sacrifice in Early Rabbinic Literature, which kind of takes the whole question of why do the first strata of rabbinic literature spend so much time talking about temple sacrifice when it has absolutely no relevance. And what she says is that it wasn't a mere substitute for the temple sacrifice, all this discourse about the sacrifice. There's something else going on. But what about the medieval rabbinic world? So if you take a quotation from Maimonides, I think this is emblematic. He says, the great book on this subject is on the Nabatean agriculture, translated by Ibn Washiyah. In a succeeding chapter, I shall explain why the Sabians had their, by which he means idolaters usually, had their religious doctrines written in a work on agriculture. The book is full of absurdities of idolatrous people, and with those things to which the minds of the multitude easily turn and adhere perseveringly. It speaks of talismans, the means of directing the influence of the stars, witchcraft, spirits, and demons that dwell in the wilderness. There occur also in this book great absurdities, which are ridiculous in the eyes of intelligent people. So this is kind of the rationalist dismissal of any search for antique objects as being somehow superstitious or laden with the search for talismans. Which is, I think, paradoxical, because in fact, Jews were great, in a sense, revivers of a classical past. What I'm showing you now is a fragment of a Masoretic biblical text. So the Masoretes were essentially the grammarians and also the biblical text preservers of the early medieval world. So they got their start probably in the 7th century, don't quite know, and they were going strong through the 10th. And they were the ones who added the vowel points and also the cantillation signs to the text of the Hebrew Bible. So they saw themselves very much as custodians of a written classical past, to the point where they invented an entire vocabulary of signs and symbols in order to explain to people how to actually reproduce those texts orally. There are lots of other biblical era texts that are non-canonical, like the Book of Ben Sira, the Damascus document, the Testament of Levi, texts that I think can rightly be considered classical, not simply heretical texts, because they circulated quite a bit in a community that we can assume was, going to synagogue and doing all the stuff it was supposed to be doing, but they certainly read widely and voraciously beyond their religious tradition. So these are texts for which there's no context whatsoever, and I think we have to conclude that they're being copied for general knowledge. How am I doing on time? Let's wrap it up? Okay. Okay, so basically, some of the themes that I've touched on, using the past to make political claims in the present, reaching back specifically into the deep imperial, or in this case, pre-Islamic past. Among Muslims, you find an additional impulse, or I shouldn't say among Muslims, but among those writing in the Arabic literary tradition, non-textual knowledge for the sake of knowledge, a kind of omnivorousness that characterizes true antiquarians. So I want to close with a question. The Fatimids did not put their first two capitals next to Carthage, which, like Tadmur and Stephanie's paper this morning, was still inhabited in the medieval period. Instead, they founded their capitals near the garrison city, the Misr of Qayrawan. And I've already referenced Fatimid consciousness of the pre-Islamic past in Coptic festivals, in their continuation of rituals associated with measuring the inundation of the Nile, in continuing certain practices of the agricultural administration of the pre-Islamic period. These are all practical matters of running the country. But what about founding their capital at Cairo? In a way, this is a $64,000 question that I myself don't know how to answer. I'm assuming that it wasn't a complete accident that the Fatimids built their Egyptian capital, not just 3 miles north of Fustat, but also to the north and across the Nile from Giza, though what they were thinking when they chose the site is a matter of speculation. In fact, it was Amr ibn al-As in the 7th century who put the garrison city of Fustat right across the Nile from Giza. So, in conclusion, I want to cite an article that Patricia Crona and Adam Silberstein published in 2010 called The Ancient Near East and Islam, the Case of Lot Casting. And what's at stake for me in citing this is something a little bit different from what was at stake for them. Their argument was that the extent to which one can reconstruct the cultural and religious history of the Near East as a single continuous narrative, rather than as disjointed parts studied under the rubrics of biblical, Greek, Roman, ancient Iranian, and Islamic history, is really in question. There's a big impediment to it, they say. You can't ask these big scale questions because of the gigantic problem of the millennium plus separating the Achaemenids from the Muslims. So Crona and Silberstein point out that this was not just a dizzying succession of empires, it was also a dizzying succession of invaders. Quote, as the foreigners moved in with their own cultural traditions, each successive high culture of the Near East was unseated and increasingly reduced to a local tradition of limited interest, they say, to those who mattered, namely the ruling elites. So they're talking about the victors writing history and the obstacles that throws in the face of historians who want to see some kind of continuity between the substrate civilizations and the conquering imperial ones. But there's something slightly different at stake for me, and I think for all of us here, which is that the first step to an integrated, long late antiquity or a continuous history of the ancient and medieval Near East would be recognizing that, in fact, the ruins of past empires were of interest to those who mattered. Thank you.